Hi, today I will talk about um, Yusuf Zulaykha, and I will specifically focus on Yusuf's beauty and his masculinity. In the Hebrew Bible, Joseph or Yusuf is one of Jacob's 12 sons, whose story is woven throughout the final chapters of the Genesis. In the Quranic account, Yusuf is the only prophet whose story gets a whole chapter on its own. According to tradition, the entire Surah Yusuf, which takes up 111 verses, was once revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. In Persian literature, Yusuf's story appears in the works of almost every poet from the classical period, um, from 9th century to the 15th century. And of course, there are reinterpretations of the story within the modern cultural productions as well. The most famous work involving the story of Yusuf is the narrative poem Yusuf o Zulaykha by Abdurrahman Jami. Jami's poem, which has generated numerous commentaries, is a reinterpretation of Surah Yusuf and the Yusuf story. The poem has been the inspiration for various literary and historical texts and continues to be a central narrative in Islamic cultures. However, the majority of these commentaries and works and reinterpretations focus on the significance of female sexuality as feminine guile or fitna and its negative implications, which is central to understanding of sexuality as it is depicted in Islam, as opposed to male sexuality. Today, I want to focus on the descriptions of Yusuf's beauty, not only in Jami's Yusuf o Zulaykha, but in the portrayal of Yusuf's masculinity in other Persian cultural productions, such as a 20th century painting, two tile works from the Qajar era, and two contemporary tableau rugs, which tell the story of Yusuf and Zulaykha. In these cultural productions, Yusuf is depicted as androgynous, and his androgyny falls under the accepted standards of beauty in pre-modern Islamicate culture. However, to the contemporary viewer familiar with rigid conceptions of gender and sexuality, this type of portrayal seems disruptive. In addition, while androgynous, Yusuf is portrayed as a passive recipient of female gaze. Therefore, that passivity basically emasculates and feminizes Yusuf. This too is basically disruptive of the pre-modern understanding of male-female active-passive gender roles in the Muslim world. So it seems that these cultural productions queer Yusuf's masculinity, and by doing that, they construct gender in a reverse manner that is challenging gender categorization and illustrating the fluidity of sexuality for both pre-modern and modern readers and viewers, albeit in different ways. Now, one of the most significant differences between the biblical and Quranic versions of Yusuf's story is in the character of Potiphar's wife, Zulaykha, and the way that in the Quranic version, Zulaykha tries to prove to Egyptian women that falling in love with Yusuf was not her fault. In Genesis 39, Potiphar's wife Zulaykha becomes infatuated with Joseph and tries to seduce him. When Joseph refuses her, she claims that he had tried to seduce her. Hearing his wife's story, Potiphar immediately believes her and imprisons Joseph. Afterwards, there is no mention of either Potiphar or Zulaykha again in the Bible. Now, the biblical account of the story highlights female desire, temptation, and vengeance. In this account, Potiphar's wife does not have a name. That is, there's no mention of her name as Zulaykha. In the Quran, other than a few occasions where Potiphar is called Al-Aziz, translated as the master, neither Potiphar nor his wife has a name. However, the character of Potiphar's wife is greatly expanded in the Quran. She falls in love with Yusuf, attempts to seduce him, and later admits it. Instead of believing his wife immediately, Potiphar questions her about the details of the incident. It becomes clear to him that the wife tore off a piece of the back of Yusuf's tunic, signifying that Yusuf was trying to get away from a seductive trap and not her. This is an interesting moment in the Quranic account due to the reversal of the Islamic female, male, and passive active gender roles, the reversal of the male gaze to a female one, and the undressing of a man by a woman. So, to prove that falling in love with Yusuf was not her fault, Potiphar's wife invites some fellow Egyptian women to her house and gives each one of them a fruit and a knife. Then she asks Yusuf to enter the house and gives each one of these women an orange and a knife. And at the same time, when Yusuf enters, women are trying to peel the orange. And when Yusuf enters, they are so struck by his beauty that they lose control of their hands and cut their hands. They admire Yusuf's beauty and call him an angel. Finally, there is unanimous agreement that Yusuf's beauty is simply too overwhelming and Yusuf is a tempting man. At this point in the Quranic account, Potiphar's wife's personal temptation has turned into a social one through the Egyptian women's participation in the act. The women compare Yusuf to a heavenly angel when they see him, and the sight of Yusuf's beauty causes women to cut their hands unconsciously. This portrayal of the oranges, knives, the cuts on their hands, and the involvement of blood and has sexual undertones. The angelic presence of Yusuf derived from the sacred evokes this eroticism in the women, but it also equally highlights his sacral role. Given that Yusuf was a prophet, he embodied a certain sacrality which further contributed to his beauty. Now, Yusuf's physical beauty, which is prophetic and sacred, functions as a catalyst for these female viewers to contemplate divine beauty on earth. And this is based on the Shahid Bazi, or the Shahid, which is a witness to the beauty and love of the divine on earth. So in the pre-modern Muslim world, the visual observation of beautiful people or objects was thought to lead the viewer to the contemplation of the divine. And beautiful people, especially young boys, were seen as emanations of divine beauty and love on earth, thereby functioning as a doorway for the Sufi wayfarer to be led to heavenly beauty and love. And this was called, as I mentioned, Shahid Bazi or Nazar Bazi, translated as gazing at the beauty of adolescent boys. According to this philosophy, one whose divine beauty and love is manifested in human form is called a Shahid, that is the eyewitness or the living testimony to divine beauty. Now, through his physical beauty, which evokes angelic presence, Yusuf becomes the Shahid for these Egyptian women to lead them to divine contemplation. Jami's poem is composed of several thousand rhyming couplets. Many aspects of the story are similar to the Bible and the Quran, though greatly elaborated. Now, the most significant changes that Jami makes to the story are to the character of Potiphar's wife, now named Zulaykha. So the first time we hear the name is in Jami's poem. In his version, Zulaykha sees Yusuf in her dreams from a young age and falls in love with him. So she never wants to be united or to be with her husband Potiphar in the matrimonial bed or in her within her marriage. At the end of the poem, Yusuf and Zulaykha are united. We see a progression from the biblical story in which Potiphar's wife plays a minimal role to the Quranic story in which she becomes a dynamic character. And ultimately, we come to Jami's poem where she has a name and is portrayed fully and sympathetically. Now, Jami's poem has largely been read in the context of Sufism and Sufi poetry and philosophy. In the Sufi context, Yusuf, as I mentioned, represents the divine beloved, and Zulaykha's love for him is the longing of human soul for reunion with the divine. Through Yusuf's beauty, Zulaykha contemplates the divine beauty and reaches enlightenment. So Yusuf becomes Zulaykha's shahid. One of the most popular scenes about Yusuf, where his gender and sexuality come into play, appear in the Quran and in Jami's Yusuf o Zulaykha and in visual arts too. This is the scene where Yusuf enters Zulaykha's party and the Egyptian women fall under the spell of his beauty. So now I want to focus on this particular scene today. And I begin by reading the way that Jami describes Yusuf when he enters the party scene. ز خلوتخانه آن گنج نهفته برون آمد چو گلزار شکفته زنان مصر کان گلزار دیدند ز گلزارش گل دیدار چیدند به یک دیدار کار از دستشان رفت زمام اختیار از دستشان رفت ز زیبا شکل او حیران بماندند ز حیرت چون تن بی جان بماندند چو دیدندش که جزو الا گوهر نیست برآمد بانگ زیشان کین بشر نیست نه چون آدم ز آب و گل سرشته است ز بالا آمده قدسی فرشته است. And this is how Griffith translates it. Like a bed of roses in perfect bloom, that secret treasure appeared in the room. The women of Memphis beheld him and took from that garden of glory the rose of a look. One glance at his beauty overpowered each soul and drew from their fingers the reins of control. When they saw that youth in his beauty's pride, no mortal is he, in amaze they cried. No clay and water composed his frame, but a holy angel from heaven he came. Now, Jami uses powerful imagery and rich language in his description of Yusuf's beauty, both in regards with erotic and esoteric context. First, he refers to Yusuf as Khalbat Khane, which is translated as hidden treasure, and De Khoda's Lughatname defines it as a sacred space where people go to pray. In Sufi discourse, according to a Hadith Qudsi, God created humans because he was a hidden treasure and he wanted to be known and loved. Here, Jami positions Yusuf in a sacred context. Then, using the words Golzar, defined as garden or flower bed, and Shegofte, defined as blooming, he draws an analogy between the sacred space for prayer and a flower bed where Yusuf was hidden. Through this analogy, Jami merges Yusuf's heavenly beauty with its earthly counterpart. Now, comparing Yusuf to a bed of roses in perfect bloom, Jami also emphasizes Yusuf's beauty and youth. When Yusuf leaves this sacred space where he was hidden as a treasure, the Egyptian women lose control of their senses with one glance at his beauty. They are bewildered with his beautiful form and body, and as a result, feel overwhelmingly enchanted. Now, Jami also refers to Yusuf's spiritual beauty several times, using words such as glory and portraying the women's consideration of him as being no mortal or a holy angel from heaven. The women observe Yusuf as a gohar, a jewel, or a precious stone. This causes the women to declare him as a superhuman being, much like an angel descended from heaven. Although Yusuf is described as an angel descended from heaven, his beauty is expressed in both divine and human forms. Putting Yusuf on display, Zulaykha makes Yusuf become the object of Egyptian women's gaze and desire. So she reverses the typical male gaze to a female one, and therefore this disrupts the familiar female passive, male active gender roles, not only for a pre-modern reader, but also for a contemporary one. This important scene has been reinterpreted and represented in later periods in the visual arts of the Islamic world in the forms of paintings and tile works as well. I want to turn to the visual arts now. So some information about visual arts in Islamicate societies. In terms of visual arts, since the human body in Islam is considered to be a source of shame, it should be concealed. So there is a prohibition against drawings and paintings of private body parts. In Islamic art, when the body is the focus of a piece of art, the emphasis is put on, I'm quoting, its expressive value, the symbolic meaning rather than its detailed anatomy, end quote. Although there has been a long history of debate on representation of human figures in Islamic art, scholars such as Diba, Bloom, and Blair have refuted the idea that Islam is hostile towards representation of human figures. These scholars have clarified that the prohibition of representation of human figures was limited to sculpture and mosque decorations. Similarly, Joseph Boone explains that since the early medieval period, quote, idealized human figures of both sexes are everywhere, and their beauty is designed to rivet the viewer's gaze, end quote. This idealized representation of the human figure was meant to convey aesthetic beauty rather than a reality. So human figures abound in miniatures as ideals, not real figures, and the taboo is more specifically on representing human genitalia and private parts rather than human figures in general. Now, what was strictly considered taboo, however, in Islam was the depiction of the divine and or the prophets. So it was idolatry to worship images of religious figures. Therefore, there are a limited number of pictorial arts in Islam, except for a few illustrated books depicting the life of the Prophet Muhammad or religious figures in the Persian world. But at the same time, Islam is a religion rich in images. Islamic visual arts include architecture and calligraphy, such as the Kaaba building in Mecca, which is Muslims' primary ritual pilgrimage space. It is also important to reiterate that in the pre-modern Muslim world, visual arts are to be displayed and enjoyed in cultural and social contexts, serving to help people contemplate and connect with the world around them, which was believed to be a reflection of the divinity. The visual contemplation of the beautiful objects or persons was to connect the viewer to the world around created by the divine. Another important aspect in pre-modern Islamic paintings was the significance of harmony and proportion. Portrayal of human beauty was a central topic in the Muslim medieval aesthetic discourse, but the majority of the writings on aesthetics focused on female beauty with details of its forms and types which set the criteria. So for instance, Ibn Qayyim describes his ideal woman as, I'm quoting, tall with slender waist, plump legs, and an ample bosom. She has a fair complexion, long black hair, a long neck, a large forehead, big black eyes with bright white, black eyebrows. Her cheeks are red and her lips pink. Her mouth is small and her nose fine. End quote. The criteria for ideal beauty in the Muslim world changed over time with the appearance of a Central Asian, Mongol, and Turkish ruling aristocracy, however. This was reflected in the visual arts of the Mamluk period, for example. In the literature of this period, human beauty is described idealistically without much concern for gender distinction. For example, a woman describes a young man in these words, and I'm quoting, "When I looked at him, I saw a face as beautiful as the full moon. It was a face on which the Supreme God has bestowed the robe of beauty, which is embroidered with the grace of his perfect cheeks." End quote. After the 14th century, cultural productions of Islamic world moved in a more emblematic and symbolic direction with a strong emphasis on spirituality, particularly in Sufi literature, which further contributed to the androgynous aspect of these depictions. Now, in this process, harmony, proportion, composition, and color also played a significant role in inspiring an emotional response in the viewer. The outward physical beauty was meant to represent inner spiritual beauty. So moral beauty and human virtue, emphasizing a harmony in the individual's character, became the essence of an outward beauty emanating inner virtue. In terms of depiction of sexuality in visual arts, it is generally believed that due to the demands of the decorum in Islam, all public depictions of sexuality and love are heterosexual. However, in the context of Persian miniature art, particularly in the early modern period, Joseph Boone argues that erotic images of both hetero and homosexual desire dominate the landscape, especially in the work of Safavid. The miniature paintings adorning book manuscripts are the most ancient artistic tradition in Persia, where the Middle Eastern male body was eroticized in the medieval period. This eroticization reached its highest of popularity in the Safavid era and spread to the Mongol and Ottoman empires too. According to Boone, and I'm quoting, Persian and later Ottoman miniature art is nothing if not aesthetically self-reflexive, and this self-reflexivity often becomes the key to deciphering the genre's homoerotic subtexts, end quote. So turning back to the scene that we discussed earlier where Egyptian women are overwhelmed by Yusuf's beauty, I want to look at the paintings, the visual arts, and the tableau rugs of contemporary tableau rugs, where Yusuf is presented as a tall man with slender waist, long curly hair, sore-made eyes, full red lips, and beautiful arched eyebrows. Yusuf's beauty is portrayed in a similar way as a woman's beauty was described in Ibn Qayyim's description of his ideal woman. However, since it is believed that after the Mamluk period, human beauty was described with less concern for gender distinction, it can be suggested that the portrayal of Yusuf's beauty in figures 1 and 2 falls under the accepted definition of the ideal beauty of that time forward, which was androgynous. Let me share my screen so I can show you these figures. All right, so as you can see here, I have the first figure. So this is a tile work, figure 1. So this is figure 1 and this is figure 2. And as you can see, this is Zolekha's party scene where Yusuf enters. And if you look at Yusuf's, if you look at Yusuf's figure and hair, and if the eyes are clear, you can see that they somehow conform to what Ibn Qayyim was describing about his ideal of beauty. So in terms of this figure 1 and this one, figure 2, both of these are Qajar paintings on tiles. The androgynous portrayal of Yusuf is probably what Joseph Boone believes had unsettled gender assumptions of the 19th century travelers to the Middle East. Now, this androgynous portrayal of Yusuf also appears in this one, which is a 20th century painting, also seems disruptive of contemporary understandings of rigid gender and sexual categorization. So as we see, all these 3 cultural productions depict Yusuf's sexual fluidity, although each in a different way. The representation of the fluidity of Yusuf's sexuality in these cultural productions not only disrupts our modern understanding of heteronormative gender and sexual binaries, but it also breaks away from the pre-modern conceptions of masculinity. Now, in these party scenes in Zolekha's house, as the object of women's gaze and the passive recipient of their desire, as you can see, he's surrounded by all women. So he's passively receiving this gaze. He becomes feminized while the women become masculinized. This is precisely against, again, the pre-modern Persian understanding of sexuality and gender roles. As Janet Afari writes, men were not necessarily identified by their sexual desires, but rather by their positionality in sexual relationships, being either passive or active. Although Afari's comment is all, about male-to-male homoeroticism, it can be used in this context, in this scene, where women's active assertion of their sexual desire basically makes Yusuf a passive recipient of that desire. So this is not only an instance of queer portrayal of Yusuf's sexuality, which is neither male nor female, but is also a reference to crossing the accepted gender norms and sexual lines of the time. The cultural productions position Yusuf at the center of an all-female gathering where his beauty is being contemplated. This is clear from figure 1, figure 2, and figure 3. Now, in figure 3, a 20th century painting, the Egyptian women are holding oranges in their and knives in their hands as Yusuf enters the room. Looking at the painting, we immediately notice that the majority of women are gazing at Yusuf. We can see the blood on the women's hands from the cuts they have inflicted upon themselves out of the wonder and amazement of Yusuf's beauty. Now, in figure 2, this one woman in the center of the painting is portrayed as senseless and entranced. This scene is a reminder of eroticized harem paintings where women are the object of male gaze and desire, resulting in male fascination, while here the male gaze has been reversed and the women are the subjects of the gaze, while Yusuf is the object. The same is true about figure 1 and figure 2, both of them Hajar paintings, and figure 3, a 20th century painting. So while each one of these paintings is differently disruptive in the context of their timeline, one thing that is common between all of them is the reversal of the gender roles. Now, although what happens in this crucial moment, both in literature and the visual arts, is not a male to female gaze, it is important to note that since Yusuf's beauty is androgynous in these paintings and he appears in an all-female gathering, these women are gazing at the beauty of an arguably feminized Yusuf. So if we consider women as still female, then we have all these women looking at another woman or feminized Yusuf, so female to female gaze. But since the gaze masculinizes women, then there is also that fluidity of the sexuality present here in this scene. So we can argue that gender is basically constructed in a reverse manner here. The gaze masculinizes the women and the object of the gaze is feminized. This is as opposed to feminist discourses such as Laura Mulvey's notion about male gaze. In this scene, it is Yusuf who appears as the mysterious, enigmatic, and fetishized object of desire. Since one of the features of male gaze is its contribution to gender power asymmetry, we observe a reversal in power dynamics and domination here, although the switch of the male gaze to the female one, particularly because Yusuf has been forced by Zulaykha to appear in this party and is later imprisoned for his beauty. More often than not, in such a scene, the object of desire is depicted as a passive recipient of an active male gaze. In this scene, Yusuf remains the passive recipient of the women's gaze. Not only does Yusuf's passivity in this scene queer his masculinity, it also reverses the gender roles and the power dynamics. So this type of beauty has the potential to disrupt the traditional images and hegemonic understandings and definitions of gender and sexuality, not only for pre-modern, but also for contemporary viewers. Yusuf's beauty in these works debunks stable and normative gender distinctions, which categorize the existence of distinct genders through prescribing discrete qualities to each gender. The reversal of the female to female passive, male active gender roles is a marker for Yusuf's lost masculinity. In this new embodiment as a passive recipient of women's gaze, there is no trace of Yusuf's manhood. This depiction challenges the validity and consistency of heteronormative discourses on gender and sexuality. Yusuf's sexual fluidity and the reversal of the gaze in this visual arts illustrate that gender and sexuality cannot be monolithically placed under rigid categories. Now, another aspect which is highlighted in these cultural productions is the symbolic spiritual layer. Yusuf's spirituality is emphasized through word choice, as I mentioned earlier, in the literature. However, in these visual arts, as you can see in these paintings, it is emphasized with a halo or a light which surrounds his head in these paintings and tile works. So one of the most important symbols of Sufism representing the individual's superior spiritual characteristic is light. Since the emphasis is Sufism in Sufism is on the inner superiority and inner virtue of the person rather than the physical beauty of an individual, Yusuf's outward beauty, regardless of his sexuality and gender, is a means to reinforce his spiritual beauty. While the halo reinforces spiritual superiority, another traditional sign of spirituality, which can be seen in this portrayal, and also the portrayal of all prophets almost, is the wearing of long beards. In traditional Arab society, the social status and the rank of a man could be recognized by the length, color, and shape of his beard. The beard, a means to draw attention to masculinity, exhibits virility. It was also a sign of intelligence, wisdom, good judgment, and authority. Now, in terms of the Sufi philosophy of Shahid Bazi, in pre-modern Iran, the appearance of such facial hair was the first sign of manhood, which signified the transition of the adolescent boy as an object of desire to an adult man as a desiring subject. Now, this marked a movement from passivity to being active for men. Therefore, while Yusuf's lack of a beard in all these cultural productions might not change our perception of his intelligence, wisdom, good judgment, and authority, it does question his masculine virility. Now, let's look at this one, this figure 4, which is a tableau rug, a painting by Mahmoud Farshtian, and this one, another tableau rug on contemporary wool Persian tableau rug. So let me tell you a little bit about these tableau rugs, which tell the story of Yusuf and Zulaykha. We see Yusuf here with no sign of beard in this two, in this one, figure 4 and figure 5. Now, after the 1979 revolution, the Islamic State enforced certain dress codes and cultural markers, one of which was wearing a beard for a man as a sign of masculinity. Now, since these tableau rugs are contemporary works of art, Yusuf's lack of facial hair may be viewed as suggestive of his lack of masculinity. In figure 4, this one, Yusuf is running away from Zulaykha's seduction. And in figure 5, Yusuf is surrounded by Zulaykha and the Egyptian women. So not only is Yusuf portrayed in these tableau rugs as having sore-made eyes, full red lips, and long black curly hair, but the fact that in, for example, figure 5, he is surrounded by these beautiful women who are not much different from him in regards to his beauty is suggestive of Zulaykha's party scene discussed earlier, where he's positioned in the center of an all-female gathering as a feminized figure himself, contributing to the reversal of the passive-active male gender roles and male gaze to female gaze. Similarly, in figure 4, we can see Yusuf's beauty is not much different from Zolekha's beauty. So in these cultural productions, Yusuf's beauty is Yusuf's masculinity and his queer beauty contest the categorization of gender and sexuality. They are proof that gender cannot be merely categorized under male, female, and sexuality under hetero-homosexual binaries. These productions confirm that gender is restrictive and sexual categorization is problematic. They are an attempt to destabilize the normative gender and sexual binaries and rigidities. What remains consistent in these cultural productions is Yusuf's queer masculinity, which is a testimony to the limits of the heteronormative definitions of gender and sexuality, and a reinforcement of the fact that the definitions of masculinity in Islamic cultural circles around dominance, coercion, and invulnerability are basically not true. These types of oppressive constructions and definitions of masculinity limit the identities and expressions of men who are beholden to this definition. Gender and sexual binaries can act as oppressive forces. These oppressive forces were circumvented in these cultural productions through the androgynous / feminine / masculine representation of Yusuf's beauty and his sexuality. Although Yusuf's spiritual power or spiritual superiority might be the main focus of all these productions, where gender and sexuality lose their meaning, the queer depictions of Yusuf's masculinity in all these cultural productions deserve attention.